apparatus came up, and it was a wonderful, never forgotten period. He loved the wide open spaces, so we often went to Sigurd, not to swim because he didn't like that kind of exercise, but to walk along the beach. We had very serious discussions, and these walks sort of crystallized them. Then we would go home and write down things. That was a normal way of working. This sort of walking in the open air seems to help mental activity. He wasn't a man who sat and studied hard. He would think all the time, and when it was ready in his mind, it came rushing up. He worked with tremendous energy and fantastic speed. I've seen him write 30 pages in one day. He worked almost anywhere, any hotel room, train, wherever he was. The remarkable thing about my association with von Neumann is perhaps that he, as a mathematician, could so quickly and easily penetrate into the problems of economics and sociology which I presented to him. That is very indicative of his basic philosophy, which was that mathematics should try to enter new areas, new fields, not only be inspired as it had been by the natural sciences. He expected that it would receive great stimulus from the other areas. And I'm sure that if he had lived, he would have made great contributions also, for example, to biology, in which field he was very much interested. But out of this study of sociology and economics on the one side and mathematics on the other came this book, which is the fruit of our joint association.
The theory of games was a landmark work in pointing the way toward the mathematization of human motivations. The theory deals with problems ranging from the two-person game, in which the goals of individuals are diametrically opposed, as in poker and war, to n-person games involving complex interaction of groups, and finally to insights into individual choice, as it is expressed in economics. In 1943, von Neumann was one of those who disappeared into the West to work on the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos, at that time, was a unique mixture of primitive living conditions, super secrecy, and brilliant scientific minds, all of which combined to create an atmosphere of intense excitement and stimulation. Von Neumann took part in most of the crucial stages of the bomb's development and was present at the detonation of the first A-bomb at the Trinity site. Nobel Prize winner Hans Bethe, leader of the Theoretical Physics Division in Los Alamos, 1943 to 1946.
In Los Alamos, in 1943, we had the problem of assembling uranium to make an atomic bomb. Dr. von Neumann was a consultant to the laboratory and visited us about 3 times a year for a week or 2 at a time. There were 2 methods being considered. One was to shoot the parts of the bomb together by a gun, and the other method was the so-called implosion, in which you surround the bomb material by high explosive and then explode this explosive so that the metal of the bomb would assemble in a sphere. In the beginning of the Los Alamos laboratory, only the first method seemed to be possible. It was von Neumann who told us and encouraged us to try the second, and who gave us a lot of information on similar work which had been done under his supervision at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, in which shaped charges had been developed. He was very positive that an implosion could be developed, and he told us that this would have added advantages for the assembly which we had not realized. one of the advantages which we had realized was that the implosion would bring the material together much faster and therefore would prevent detonation of the weapon before full assembly. Another advantage which he pointed out was that the implosion might squeeze the material and might thereby increase the efficiency of the weapon. Even after his encouragement, however, we still found it very difficult to assemble the material by implosion. There were experiments made under the leadership of Dr. Kistiakowsky of Harvard to study the explosive method without the uranium being around. And unfortunately, they gave all sorts of irregular shapes. Well, this did not trouble von Neumann at all. He suggested to us that we use something to focus the implosion, focus in a similar way as light is focused by a lens. And this device, in fact, has been called an explosive lens. Afterwards, he designed for us some configuration of explosive lenses which actually worked and which was finally used in the assembly that we used for the first bomb in Trinity and afterwards in Nagasaki.
Von Neumann loved Los Alamos. The spectacular scenery, the magnificent climate, and the many friendships drew him back again and again. He would go along with friends on anything, from a mule trip into the mountains to a set of tennis with Stan Ulam, but always in his Oxford gray business suit. During the period he was working in Los Alamos, von Neumann became intensely interested in computers. Dr. Herman Goldstein, now of the IBM Corporation, was one of his earliest collaborators in this work. In the spring of 1966, Dr. Goldstein was invited to visit a warehouse of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where the original Princeton computer is stored. He was accompanied by Dr. Uta Mertzebach of the Smithsonian staff.
Oh, these things would have fascinated Johnny. He used to love toys. When he worked on the on his automata theory, at the beginnings he started, since he had to make three-dimensional objects, he bought the biggest Tinker toy set that he could find, and he made the objects out of these until we showed him one time how to make these two-dimensionally, so he was able to give the Tinker toys to Morgenstern's son.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, as Johnny would have said, mercy. Here it is. All these years. May I move the curtain?
Would you?
Sure, be glad to. Let's see what it looks like. If I can do it. Very good. I succeeded.
There you are.
Yes.
I need to know.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
This machine was the concrete embodiment of von Neumann's very great ideas and contributions which he has made to the electronic computer field. In 1946, Johnny asked me if I would join him at the end of the war in Princeton and help him to carry out in concrete form the ideas which he had been working on in 1944 and 1945. Of course, I jumped at the chance. We rushed to Princeton and got started. The machine that eventuated from that is the one you see here, and it contains essentially those things which the modern computer has in it, although in somewhat primitive form. This machine has stored program concept as its major feature, and that, in fact, is the thing which makes the modern computer revolution possible. The older machines required one to clumsily perform hand pluggings of connections which took hours, indeed days. It meant that programming was an art, in fact, a very black art. And furthermore, it meant that the total number of instructions one could write were comparatively small. This new concept has been carried so far today that programs are written involving tens of millions of instructions, whereas in those days, of course, nobody dreamed of such complexity, but Johnny's idea made this basically possible. What is the stored program concept? Well, it's the notion that you can describe in a finite number of words, in fact, a fairly small number of words, in a fairly simple language, exactly and unequivocally the description of a problem, and that this description is then translated into binary digits and stored in the memory of the computer exactly as numbers are stored. This was the discovery by Johnny. You may say, what's so remarkable about that? Well, the only thing I can tell you in answer to that is it's just like the wheel. What's so remarkable about the wheel? When you look at it, you can't conceive how anybody would not have known that there was one. Indeed, it must have been that the moment somebody mentioned the wheel or somebody mentioned the stored program, everybody around us obviously knew that this was the way to do it. And in fact, we accepted it immediately. It was not one of these inventions or discoveries which is enormously complicated and few people can understand. It's tremendously simple. It immediately hits a person and he knows that's it. Now, this, I believe, was his great discovery. And curiously enough, it relates back in a very interesting way to his very early mathematical works, which were in the domain of formal logics. He, however, had other interests, and I think his second great contribution to the computing field lay in his work at Los Alamos in showing the experimental people there how it was possible by mathematical modeling to formulate the problems with which they were grappling in mathematical form, indeed in systems of partial differential equations which express the conservation laws of hydrodynamics. And then to translate those complicated, implicit equations into explicit, finite systems of difference equations. And these systems of difference equations then can be solved on the computer. And indeed, this is the reason why initially he had this great interest in the computer. But you see, it led him to develop many of the things in numerical analysis that we know today. Now, the third thing, really, which he did for the field was to bring his great prestige to the subject, to make the notion of computation stylish, if you will. He showed people that it's no longer necessary to do tedious experimentation, that it's possible much more conveniently to do experiments, if you will, on the computer by numerical techniques. I think in part he did this because he was very much of the computer himself. He had great facility at numerical processes. And in fact, I can tell you an anecdote which I think may interest you some. It happened down at Aberdeen early on during the war, and what he was doing then was consulting frequently at Aberdeen, coming on up to Philadelphia to talk with us about the ENIAC. Now, this particular day, in fact, the day prior to this one, a young mathematician who subsequently has become a famous person had come in with several colleagues, and we were talking about a problem with which he was grappling. And he was getting nowhere and asked our help. Well, none of us was able to do anything with it analytically. So he said, well, the heck with it. I'm going to take a computer, a Frieden or Marchant or Monroe home tonight, and I'm going to calculate a few special cases. And fine, he did. And the next morning he came in at 5:30 looking awful. He had bags under his eyes. He was fatigued. He was unshaved. He was, in fact, in very bad way, but he had triumphed. He had calculated the first 5 cases. And he was busy telling us about this when who should bust in but Johnny from Los Alamos. And he said, well, what's new, fellas? And we said, oh, well, so-and-so has been busy with the following idea, and he's in trouble with it. And he said, well, let's see what it's like. And he tried for a couple of minutes, and he said, no, he said, that's sort of intractable analytically. let me see what's doing with this thing numerically. Let me evaluate a few cases. So he did. In about 1 minute, he threw his head back, and he said, 16.25. And you could hear the numbers rolling through his head. You could actually hear them. He was mumbling them. And in about a minute, he did the first case, and maybe 1.25 minutes the second, and 1.5 minutes the third, and 2 minutes the fourth. And he came then to the crucial case, the one which this fellow had spent his whole night working out. And this chap was very clever, and he listened closely to von Neumann as he was rolling through n equals 5. And when he judged he was about halfway through, he recognized a number, and he waited an instant, and then he said 26.75. And you could just see von Neumann kind of come to a shuddering halt. And he said, huh? And this boy said, 26.75, Professor von Neumann. And von Neumann said, just a minute. And he got very nervous, and he began to compute again, and you could hear the tempo going up much more than it had before. And after another minute, he said 26.75. Yes, he says, that's right. And whereupon this fellow ran out of the room because he couldn't stand it any longer, and I made childish chatter trying to keep von Neumann distracted while he paced up and down nervously, saying to himself, how could that guy have possibly done that? What trick? And after an hour or so, we finally told him. But at any rate, that's sufficient to illustrate his great ability as a computer himself and the great feeling he had for computation. Now, this whole field owes so much to von Neumann's genius that it's really very difficult to tell you exactly what would have happened if this hadn't been built. I can only say that his stored program concept might not ever have been discovered by another person, or it might have taken many years before it was discovered, and almost as important as that, perhaps, not from a mathematician's point of view, but from a economic point of view, his great prestige as a mathematician sold the notion of the computer and its great importance to the industrialists and to the government officials who made this whole development possible.
The immense strides in computer technology that were spurred by von Neumann's work had as one result the speeding up of the development of the H-bomb. The reputation that von Neumann earned for his work during this period drew him more and more into contact with industry and government. By the early 1950s, he was devoting nearly all of his time as a high-level consultant to various governmental agencies. Some of his friends felt he spread himself too thin.
I wish he'd been more economical with his time in that respect. For example, if people called him to Washington or elsewhere, he would very readily go and so on. Instead of having these people come to him, it was much more important, I think, that he should have saved his time and effort. That he felt when the government called that one had to go. It was a patriotic duty. And as I said before, he was a very devoted citizen of the country here. And I think one of the things that particularly pleased him was any recognition which came sort of from the government. In fact, in that sense, I felt it sometimes somewhat peculiar that he would, be impressed by government officials or generals and so on. If a big uniform appeared, that made more of an impression than it should have done.
Yes,
it was odd. But it shows that he was a person of very many different and sometimes self-contradictory facets, I think.
In October 1954, John von Neumann was appointed as a member of the Atomic Energy Commission. But only a few months later, he was hospitalized with the cancer that was to end his life. Admiral Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission during that period.
I remember one particular incident at Walter Reed Hospital, the Army Hospital here in Washington, when the Defense Department felt that it had to consult him. He was their chief scientific advisor on Air Force matters. And I recall the extraordinary picture of sitting beside the bed of this man in his 40s who had been an immigrant. And there surrounding him were the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Secretaries of Air, Army, Navy, and the Chiefs of Staff.
Despite the pressures of his involvement in governmental work, von Neumann in his last years struck out boldly into the almost unexplored field of automata. His interest in this field first led him to consider the possibility of constructing reliable machines that would utilize unreliable components. He reasoned that if the human brain could continue to function well, even after some degree of damage, that a large and complex machine might be made to do the same. This is in sharp contrast to present-day computing machines, in which failure of a single component may lead the machine to produce results that are complete gibberish. But perhaps his most daring work in automata was his attempt to develop a machine not only capable of reproducing itself, but of an evolutionary process in which succeeding generations construct machines of increasing complexity. In his last work, The Computer and the Brain, von Neumann suggested that logic and mathematics in the central nervous system, when viewed as languages, must be structurally essentially different from any of the languages in our experience. It is ironic that, though his work in automata was left incomplete, the enormous possibilities that it opened up may yet prove to be his most significant contribution to science.
Von Neumann was many things. He was a mathematician, he was a physicist, a chemist, an economist, a human being, of course, and he tried to be more. Now, my point of view is prejudiced. I wanted him to be nothing but a mathematician. And in what I call mathematics, pure mathematics as distinguished from its physical applications, in that work he stopped functioning by the early or middle 1940s. And I don't think it was the war that had anything to do with it, or his subsequent illness. His interest changed. So I don't think if he had lived longer he would have accomplished more along the lines of pure mathematics. But I think he could have if he had wanted to. If he devoted all of the long life to mathematics, he might have had a place with the all-time greats of mathematics. As it is, I sometimes think that though he was tremendous while he was alive and while he had a very important effect on the mathematics of this century, somehow 2 or 3 centuries from now, he will have become a relatively minor figure. He did not, I think, fulfill himself in the sense of using the talent that he had to its fullest. He spread it thinner than some people do. He had too much of it, perhaps, and that made for a peculiar wastage.
Some people felt that what he did was to cast about randomly, looking for new directions to move. But he really was not going in random directions at all. He was really seeking to see in which areas the tools of mathematics, which he had at his command, could be brought to bear to change some subject fundamentally from a non-mathematical to a mathematical one. I think it's fair to summarize his contributions by saying that what he did were very, very difficult things, they were very profound, and that they inevitably altered not only his own mathematical career, but that of mathematics itself.
Edward Teller, friend and colleague.
Many people have wondered how Johnny von Neumann could think so fast and so effectively. How he could find so many original solutions in areas where most people did not even notice the problems. I think I know a part of the answer, perhaps an important part. Johnny von Neumann enjoyed thinking. I have come to suspect that to most people thinking is painful. Some of us are addicted to thinking. Some of us find it a necessity. Johnny enjoyed it. I even have the suspicion that he enjoyed practically nothing else. This explains a lot, because what you like, you do well. And he liked thinking, not just in mathematics. He liked thinking in the clear and complete manner of mathematicians, in every field. In mathematics, in physics, in the business world, his father was a banker. In many other fields. He could and did talk to my 3-year-old son on his own terms. And I sometimes wondered whether his relation to the rest of us were a little bit similar. This also explains his effectiveness in connection with computing machines. Because computing machines apply logical processes to fields, not only mathematics, but to others as yet untouched by the logical process. And it is very significant that this revolution, the revolution of the electronic brains, was practically initiated by Johnny von Neumann. I cannot think of Johnny now without remembering a very tragic circumstance. When he was dying of cancer, his brain was affected. I visited him frequently, and he was trying to do what he always tried to do. And he was trying to argue with me, as he used to. And it wasn't functioning anymore. And I think that he suffered from this loss more than I have seen any human to suffer in any other circumstance.